All right, let's get this party started. Welcome, class, to Classics 160B1. Meet the Ancients! And today's class on Archaic Greece. We are diving wholeheartedly today into the period of Greece where we start to get all the developments that we associate, right, with the wonderful world of ancient Greece. Now, I, of course, am your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today, let's see, what lecture are we at today? Bring down the lights, bring up the projector. It is lecture 5.2, Archaic Greece. So let me go ahead and shrink myself, get my big head out of the way here. Ah, I'm shrinking. All right, and there, that seems reasonable. Okay, let's go ahead and get started here. We're going to start with a few announcements. We are going to recap the 8th century Renaissance, the beginning of the Archaic period, when we get a flourishing that we just hadn't seen for 400 years during the Dark Ages. From there, we are going to discuss some of the achievements of ancient Greek culture, some of the things that we really associate with ancient Greece, and we'll see kind of not only what they are, but how they arose. And along the way, you're going to pick up a few kind of characteristics that you can take with you whenever you yourself go to Greece, or you go to a museum or anything like that. You're going to be able to do some identification about what's what, when it dates to, what it represents, that sort of thing. So actually, in addition to like whatever your Word doc is today, if you can get like an actual old school notebook where you can do a few little drawings, they don't have to be good, but if you can sketch a few things, that's going to be really useful today. So go ahead and check that out. All right, let's see what our announcements actually are. So same thing as Monday, right? Go ahead and put this into speaker view. You can see me. You can see the screen. You can see the words and the images. And you can see everything you need. If you have a question, go ahead and direct it to your teaching assistant and they will do their best to answer you, or they will funnel that question to me and I will get back to you as soon as I can on that. And then the only other thing on the horizon, it's not due this Friday, but a week from Friday, your research proposal. So kind of where you should be right now, you should have a good sense for kind of what you want to do. You don't have to have the thing written yet, but you should have a pretty good sense of your topic for that proposal. And you should start poking around for sources for that. And that's actually one of the main things that we're going to do this Friday is I'm going to kind of lead you through what different types of sources are and how to find them. It sounds really easy to be like, oh, like I'm studying the story of Jason and the Argonauts. I'll just go look up the ancient source for Jason and the Argonauts. And it just turns out that it's like much more labor intensive and confusing than you would expect, okay? And so that's not your fault, but you do want to pay attention there because I'm going to give you some strategies for how to hunt those things down. Because really the kind of stories that we frequently get from ancient Greece, the stories that you're hearing about in a class like this, are frequently compilations of different partial or fragmentary ancient sources. And that's why when you go back to look at the ancient source, it can be confusing to figure out which one to use or where to find them, that sort of thing. So more on that on Friday. I'll lead you through how to go through that process. Okay, so let's go ahead and recap the 8th century Renaissance. So if we remember back to last week, we were talking about the collapse at the end of the Bronze Age. From this period of giant Minoan and Mycenaean palaces to a period of real small-scale settlements, not very sophisticated art, that sort of thing. And then all of a sudden, around 800 BCE, we start to get another flourishing. This is what we call the 8th century Renaissance. We get population increases. We get a kind of further sophistication in art. We get expansion across the Mediterranean. We get developments in art and architecture. And one of the things that you kind of want to remember, right, one of our starting points for thinking about this is we want to keep in mind that when we're talking about ancient Greece, it really is substantially different than kind of what we're talking about when we talk about modern Greece, right? Modern Greece, it's a country in Southern Europe, right? So you can see like kind of the boundary wherever it is up there, right? You can kind of see the actual national line between Greece and Albania and Macedonia and Bulgaria. Turkey's its own separate thing across the Aegean. And when we look at Greece in the ancient world, we have to go through and erase all those boundaries, right? You do get different cultural and ethnic groups, but those kind of borders are very fluid. They're not the same kind of sharp lines on a map that we get today. And one of the things that we're kind of looking at here is when we look at kind of the core of ancient Greece, we're really looking at mainland Greece plus the islands plus Western modern day Turkey, the region that we call Ionia, right? So this whole region here is what we consider the core of ancient Greece. And then all these other little black dots, that's what starts to happen during the 8th century as those city-states start to send out different ships and groups of people to establish colonies throughout the Mediterranean. Now, one of the kind of reasonable questions to ask then is like, if, all these different city-states are all politically independent, why do we even refer to Greece as a whole thing anyway, right? Why do we refer to it as a coherent entity instead of just talking about the Athenians or the Spartans or the Thebans, like that, right? And that's because they share a lot of cultural traits, right? So they share a language, they share writing, they share cultural things like sport, they share an artistic style, they share a religion, they share a style of architecture, they share a style of warfare, they share trade networks, right? They share eating and drinking habits. Lots of different cultural traits are similar from city-state to city-state, even though those political entities are separate, okay? So even though they're separate, the cultural traits are relatively common from city-state to city-state. Now, what are some of the developments of that 8th century, right? So we just talked about this a little bit. One big one is colonization. Population is growing, population's increasing, and one of the things that ends up happening then, right, is that Greeks are moving out of this kind of core area here that we were just looking at, and they're establishing colonies all over the place, right? So along the Black Sea, North Africa, Egypt, right? The site of now Crates is founded in the 7th century BC. We get lots of colonies in southern Italy, near modern-day Naples, ancient Neapolis, right? That's what it comes from. The island of Sicily, southern France, the French Riviera. That's a nice place to build a colony. And actually, the modern city of Marseille is the ancient city of Massilia. It's a Greek colony there. And then also even the east coast of Spain. Now, while the Greeks are doing this, we haven't talked much about it yet, but one of the things you want to keep in the back of your mind is that they're not the only culture going through this process. So the Phoenicians, highlighted in blue, kind of dark blue and purple here, they're doing something similar, right? So their kind of core area is along the Levant, modern day Israel, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, that kind of region. And they are also going out across the Mediterranean, establishing colonies in North Africa, sites like Leptis and Carthage, and up into southern Spain and eastern Spain. So the modern city of Cadiz is actually the ancient city of Gades. It's an ancient Phoenician city. And we'll see this one city-state in particular, Carthage, that is going to play a very big role in both our history of Greece and then a super big role when we get into the second half of the course with our story of the ancient Roman world. And what we can do is we can zoom in here on southern Italy and Sicily and just see how prevalent this colonization process is, right? So all of these are Greek city-states. And so once again, remove the idea of kind of like, oh, this is Italy. Italy is Italians, right? Like there are Italian tribes there, but it's very heavily influenced by Greek colonization. So again, take those modern day country borders, take them out of your brain and throw them away. All right, good. And this gets so populated with Greeks that we actually call this region Magna Graecia. Okay, so along with the colonization process, we get a couple developments during the 8th century that come to exemplify and embody what we think of when we think of ancient Greece. So we get the very, very first Olympics in 776 BCE. And this is important not just because it's a sporting event, but because this is an event that brings together Greeks from all different sorts of city-states, right? So we get Athenians and Spartans, and we get people from the Peloponnese near Elis, where kind of close to where Olympia actually is, all coming together to compete. And the very first games is won by this guy, Coroebus of Elis, a local baker who won the sprint race, which at the time was the only event in the Olympics. Now, the Olympic Games were also dedicated to the god Zeus. And one of the interesting things there, right, is that we see this really close relationship between religion and sport in the Greek world. And along the lines of religion, we also start to get other developments on that front. So what we're looking at here is a temple to the goddess Hera. It's a little model of a temple found near the site of Argos. And the Argive Heraion, that's the kind of term for the temple of Hera at Argos. But this becomes one of the major cult sites to Hera in the ancient Greek world. But we can see very, very early on that these temples look super similar to houses. And so that's exactly what a temple is. It's a house for the gods and for the goddesses. And so we can see the early development here. And later today, we're going to see what that turns into over the course of the subsequent centuries. We also get the return of iconographic art, right? So we can go through and this would be, a very rough thing to kind of keep in mind, right? I don't need you to be able to draw a perfect image of this, but you should be able to know if you get a picture of a sweet vase with a giant octopus on it, you should be able to say, that's Bronze Age. And if you get a dumpy looking vase with a couple circles on it, you should be able to be like, that's Dark Ages. And what we get coming out of the Dark Ages in the 8th century is what's called the geometric style of pottery. And that's for kind of sort of obvious reasons. It's very geometric. But we get the return of iconography, right? So you actually see people here. We have soldiers down here with shields. We have chariots. We have somebody who's deceased. And this particular vase was actually a grave marker for the deceased. And we see people mourning the deceased up here. So this geometric style, you should be able to say, hey, that's right in the 8th century coming out of the Dark Ages. And we'll see how that progresses later on in the rest of today's lecture. And we also get the reinvention of writing. And when I say invention, it's not like somebody was like, Homer was sitting around and he was like, I'm going to invent writing today. It's going to be awesome. Everybody's going to love this. And I'm going to write some sweet epic poems. So it's not like somebody's coming out with this from nowhere. Instead, what we're getting the Greeks adapting a written script that already exists in Phoenicia. And so what you can see here, right, you can see the kind of formal Greek letters in this column right here. And then over here, you can see their Phoenician equivalents, right? So it's not that difficult to see how this kind of sign in Phoenicia translates into an alpha in Greek, which is the same letter as our A, right, in the Latin alphabet. And you can see some of the other similarities as well, right? You can look at the Greek letter delta, what it looks like in Phoenician, and then some of these other ones as well. And what you're looking at, right, you can also, as we move left here, you can start to see the precursors to the Phoenician script. And that's what we call, you can't really read this word right here, and you don't need to memorize it or anything like that. But this is called hieratic. And hieratic is, you can think of this as the cursive form of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Okay? And so, hieroglyphs, the actual formal forms you can see in this column here. These are what you would have gotten in Middle Egyptian when they're writing things like the dispute between a man and his ba, or the tale of the eloquent peasant, right? They would have been writing it out in chiseling it into the wall in these kind of formal letters. But there was a cursive form, right? And you can see the kind of similarities between these, but a much, much easier way to actually write. Then Phoenician script gets kind of derived from that, and the Greek script from the Phoenician script. So kind of building off what was already there. Now, this was very, very different. What came out of this was very, very different than what the Greeks had in the Bronze Age. So on the left-hand side, you're looking at the linear B script. So a ceramic tablet with the script on it. It had been burned, so it turned into actual like pottery, basically. And this is syllabic. So each one of these things either stands for a syllable, and there's something like 90 of those, or it stands for an ideogram, okay? And what an ideogram or a pictograph is basically an image that represents a concept, okay? So this also comes from Egyptian hieroglyphs. So you'll write it out, right? You can write out what the word is. And then if you were talking about a person, you'll put the pictograph or the ideogram for the person at the end of that. Or if you're doing something like that, you write out the name for like the gods or something like that, and then you put the ideogram for a god. Or you write out something like that and you put the ideogram for a house, all right? So it's a way to conceptualize an entire idea in a picture of that. Now, when we get to the Greek language, those ideograms or pictographs are gone. When we get to the Greek script in the 8th century, and what it's replaced by is an alphabet. And this alphabet does a couple really interesting things. The big one is that it starts to have both consonants and vowels. Okay? And so that's super important. When you look back at the Phoenician script doesn't actually have vowels, so it's all consonants. The Greek script, the way they adapt it, they build in vowels. And so what that means is you now have an unambiguous way of creating almost every sound a person can make, right? Some combination of consonants and vowels. If you were doing this in Phoenician without the vowels, you have to know the language to know what kind of vowel to supply in between consonants. So if you know the language, you can kind of understand the script. But without knowing the language, you don't really know what it's supposed to sound like because the vowels aren't there in the writing. But in the Greek language, it is there. And now that you can make all these sounds, it becomes a perfect mechanism for recording things that people are saying, right? When we look back at the Bronze Age, this is record keeping. But when we look in the Archaic period, right, in the 8th century, we can record what people are saying. And we think that this is eventually the way that they're recording, right? These epic poems that are being performed orally. And this is what we get, right? This is our very first piece of Greek writing in the Greek world. It's called the Cup of Nestor. And so you can see the actual cup right here. It's in the geometric style, right? So you can note that this is a much smaller, much simpler version of that big piece of pottery we looked at earlier, right? Similar kind of stylistically, but on a much smaller, simpler scale. And then you can see the transcription of the inscription, right? So this is it in Greek. Here's our transcription, or our translation here. Nestor's cup, good to drink from. Whoever drinks from this cup, him straightway the desire of beautiful crowned Aphrodite will seize. And so again, this is an allusion to something that shows up in the Iliad, this cup of Nestor, which is a giant golden goblet that only the strongest men can wield, and it takes 2 hands to pick it up and drink from it. And this is like a tiny little piece of pottery here, so it's kind of a joke on that, and that if you drink enough wine, you're going to fall in love with Aphrodite. Now, one of the interesting things here is if you look at the actual inscription, right? This is, it's interesting in the sense that it's written backwards, right? And that's not because this is flipped, right? I haven't accidentally like flipped the image here. This is the way the text actually looks, right? So you can see Nestoros right here, and then we can see it going this way, and the letters face that direction as well. And that's actually the way the earliest Greek language was written, right? So the earliest Greek alphabet was written from right to left with the letters facing that direction. And that's another way that we can tell that it was derived from Phoenician. That was the Phoenician way of doing things. The Greeks adopt that style as well. But what's kind of cool is that over time we can see this development here. So they start out writing it from right to left like this. They eventually next move to a thing where it starts out from right to left, and then the next line goes from left to right, and then right to left. And you can see it here, right? That it's like, all right, so this is our classic left to right, and then it changes direction. And then it changes direction again, and again, and again, and again. And this is known as boustrophedon, this kind of style of alternating directions there, right? So you don't need to remember that kind of name. But eventually, that then evolves into what we now kind of see as traditional Greek writing, which is left to right in the style that we write English today. So kind of a cool development. Again, we can see the linkages to the Phoenician script, and then it going both ways, and then eventually in the style that we see today. Okay, don't know why I had 2 more slides there. Anyway, all right, so we're gonna move into some new stuff now. And what I wanna start to talk about is, before we get into the characteristics of archaic Greece, I wanna talk a little bit about why archaic Greece sticks out, okay? So we've talked already about some of the developments with, the Olympics and architecture and things like that. And one of the questions is like, why is this all happening in Greece? Why is Greece so different than other parts of the world, right? And kind of why, essentially why do we, how do I put it? Yeah, what's structurally different about Greece, and how does it lead to some of the developments we're going to talk about? Now, again, when we talk about archaic Greece, this is frequently the conception, right? Archaic Greece is very archaic. And again, what I want you to do is take that conception from your brain and throw it away, get rid of that. Archaic Greece is incredibly innovative. This is going to be the period where we talk about Greek temples and democracy and awesome pottery. This is all happening during the archaic period, right? It's all being invented during the archaic period. And so the question then is why? Why is this period so innovative and new compared to the rest of the world, and what's going on then? Now, the overarching argument that I would make here is that one of the reasons it's so incredibly innovative, and one of the reasons it's so different than other parts of the world, is that Greece during this period moves consistently and substantially compared to other parts of the world from a kind of level of inequality towards equality. All right? And what we're going to see is that compared to other parts of the world, this is the exact opposite of what's happening elsewhere. Okay? So if we gaze over to the Near East, and we're going to do this actually starting next week, we're going to go check in and see what's going on with the empires over there. But they're consolidating more and more power into a single person. And the Greeks kind of go the opposite direction, right? Whereas there might have been a king in a Minoan palace or a Mycenaean palace. During the Archaic period, that power starts to slowly disperse to a larger group of people. Now, important caveat here, right? When I say that we're moving towards equality, right? And that by the time we get to classical Greece, right, all these citizens can vote and there's a democracy, let's not get carried away, okay? Let's keep in mind here that this equality is limited still in a large number of ways. So first of all, Greece is still very much a society whose economy is built on slave labor, all right? Now that slavery isn't the same as kind of the United States in the 18th and 19th century. Where it's very racially based. It's based kind of somewhat on ethnicity, but not really. It's really more who you conquer in battle, and then those people are frequently sold into slavery. But it's still like that's a core facet of what's going on in Greece. If you're a foreigner in any sort of city-state, you can't vote. If you're a woman, you can't even be a citizen, right? So that's half the population right there. You can't vote. Children, right, can't vote. So when we think about this and when we talk about equality, I do want you to keep in mind that this is kind of unique in terms of what's going on in the world at the time, but also keep in mind that this isn't like a perfectly egalitarian society, right? Where every individual, no matter their gender or race or ethnicity or socioeconomic status, is perfectly equal. Okay, so when we look at the political development here, right? we can see the development over the course from the Bronze Age to the Dark Age to the Archaic period. And in the Bronze Age, we start with this group of people known as Wanakes, right? The Wanaks was the leader of an ancient kind of Bronze Age Greek city-state. So you could picture the Wanaks as the guy in the palace at Knossos, or the Wanaks as the ruler of a site like Mycenae. These are known as like great kings, okay? And as we move into the Dark Ages, they actually come up with a completely different name for the rulers of these city-states, right? The city-states had become much, much smaller, but we still have a single individual ruling those. Or at least that's kind of what the later Greeks attributed the political style to of the Dark Ages. And this is where we get the term basileus, and that's the term for king, and it's still used as a term in Greek for king today. Basileis is the plural term here. So again, a king, but their power has sort of diminished over time, right? They can't control quite as large of an area. And during the Archaic period, we then move from the basileus to what's called an oligarchy, right? Which very literally translates as the rule of a few. Now, it's still an aristocratic group of people here, okay? So it's still a group of aristocrats ruling these city-states in large part. That differs from city-state to city-state. But we're seeing a slow development, right? A slow dispersion of power from a single great king to multiple people having a role in the political process. And we'll see as we go through the Archaic that eventually culminates in what we'd call democracy. Now, here's the question. Why does that happen, right? So what is it about Greece that has Greece go through this process, right? Kind of dispersing power and moving from like the Wanaks of the Bronze Age down to the Basileus of the Dark Ages, down to the like oligarchy of Archaic Greece, right? And there are three explanatory factors that I wanna go through here, okay? So the first is a more even distribution of wealth, right? So if you have in your notes like, why does Greece move towards equality? You're gonna have three different things here. The first is a more even distribution of wealth. And a good example here, right, is Herodotus, writing in the 400s, is looking back on the Archaic period, and he's talking about a shipbuilder. And this shipbuilder has like 6,000 talents of silver. A talent is a weight measure. And Herodotus is amazed by this. This is enough to build a ship. It's enough to hire people to row the ship and pay them for like a year. And Herodotus is like, that is an incredible amount of wealth. Now, if you look over from this same time period and you kind of turn your gaze to the east and you see what's going on in Persia, the level of wealth of not even the emperor, right? Or not even like the king or the emperor, the guy ruling the Persian Empire. If you just look at kind of the aristocrats, you see them having levels of wealth where it's like 10 times that amount, okay? And so what we end up seeing is that the richest people in Greece have a much smaller level of wealth than the really rich people over in the empires of the Near East. Okay, so that's one of the things there. Explanatory thing number 2. We get a very new style of warfare that emerges during this period, okay? So when you read the Iliad and you're listening, or you're looking at styles of warfare, it's based on like heroes, right? Going out and slaying people with their spear, and it's great for telling a wonderful story. It's not the most effective way of actually fighting. And what develops during the Archaic period is a new style of warfare that actually promotes equality, okay? And this is known as Phalanx style warfare, okay? So Phalanx is the term for the Greek kind of army formation, all right? And what you're looking at here is our earliest evidence for this. So it dates back into the 7th century, around 650 BC, and this is known as the Kiji Vase. This is how I don't know if you like anybody out there takes Italian or whatever, but the pronunciation's kind of weird. You'd think it's the Kiji Vase, but it's actually the Kiji Vase because it's Italian and it belonged to the Kiji family or something like that. But what you can see here is that in this style of warfare, you've got Greek soldiers, heavily armored, lined up very, very close to each other. All right? And you can see what that armor looks like on this statue of a hoplite. So the hoplite is the name for the soldier, and the phalanx is the name of the formation. And so here's what you've got. Here's the kind of formation here. You've got a really large shield, and you're heavily armored, and you've got a really long spear. And the way that this is going to work, all right, your shield is going to be large enough that it covers half of you and half of the person next to you over here. All right? And your spear is going to be long enough that it sticks through these little gaps in the shield. You can see a little gap over here, right? And so what you've got is you've basically got a giant wall of armor, right? That moves forward very, very slowly because they're covered in huge amounts of armor, move forward very, very slowly. And you just stick people with the pointy end of the spear. And this is incredibly, incredibly effective at the time, okay? And the idea behind it, though, is that when you're a group, when you're in phalanx formation, all right, you're almost nearly impenetrable, right? But if that phalanx breaks, if you go and start trying to fight on your own like you think you're Achilles or something like that, you're going to get killed almost immediately. And the reason for that, right, is you can't move very fast because you're covered in so much armor. Your spear's way too long for you. So you can't do anything actually with people up close. And generally, you're very clumsy. And so this idea that everybody in the phalanx, right, is protecting not only themselves, but also the person next to them. And that the phalanx only works when everybody's essentially equal. Again, is this kind of like military formation that then leads to the promotion of equality, not just in the military, but kind of in society at large. And so again, when you watch the 300, right, you can see the phalanx formation over here, and this is somewhat how it would have looked. So 6 to 8 rows deep, right, and then being the last person on the right-hand side of the formation actually would have been kind of an honored position because that's the only position where, like, you're not totally covered by the shield, right? You're covering half of you and the person to your left, but, like, your right-hand side is still exposed. So that's kind of a place of honor in the formation. Okay, so what we've seen so far, we've seen a more even distribution of wealth, and then we've also seen the kind of new warfare battle formation that promotes equality. And then finally, and I mentioned this a little bit before, one of the things that we see here that's very, very different than other parts of the world at this time is that religiously and ideologically, no political power has a monopoly over the gods, right? So it's kind of this separation between church and state, kind of, sort of, if that makes sense, right? So it's not total separation. It's not like you're never going to hear Zeus's name when you're in the assembly talking about, whether you should go to war with Sparta or something. But what's different here is that when you look at the empires of the Near East, the people in political power and in the priesthoods, they kind of control access to the gods. You have to go through them to be able to access the gods or sacrifice to the gods, that sort of thing. When you get to the Greek world, right, while there are still priesthoods and people that worship the gods for a job, anybody can make a sacrifice to the gods at any given time, okay? And that kind of ability to not have a monopoly over access to the gods is another thing that puts everybody somewhat on an equal playing field. So those are the three kind of, three of the potential explanatory factors for why we see this movement in the Greek world from kind of, from fairly consolidated political power to something that's more dispersed, right? More equal distribution of wealth, new battle formations that emphasize equality, and an ideology says that anybody can have access to the gods. Quick question in the chat here about what they were sacrificing. And it's everything, right? So you can see like a little, I think that's a little pig being sacrificed there. They would burn incense. Any sort of animal could be sacrificed, that sort of thing. And if you go back to the story of Hesiod, you actually get the origin of the sacrifice, where it was Prometheus actually playing a trick on Zeus. And Zeus ends up eating the bones. And so when you sacrifice, you kind of sacrifice the bones, and then a lot of times people actually still eat the meat from that sacrifice. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about some of the developments from archaic Greek culture. Let's first spell culture correctly. Hey, there we go. Excellent. Okay, archaic Greek culture. Why don't we go ahead and do attendance for today as well, and then we'll dive into this. So I'm gonna shoot through a couple slides here. Zoom, zoom, zoom. Zoom, 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 zoom. All right. So attendance 10 today, February 10th. Go into D2L and select orange. Orange like my drink. Orange like Heracles. Select orange for today, and you're gonna be happy that you did, because you'll get your attendance grade. Question, if we're working in groups on the project, do we all need to write individual rough drafts, or are we just turning in one per group? That's a great question. What you're going to do is you just need to write one, okay? And then I need to add a column, or, yeah, I'll go ahead. Can somebody add a column? Maybe one of the TAs or something? Add a column to that spreadsheet, and add a column that just says, like, who's the submitter person? Or maybe just bold your name or something like that, who's ever submitting. And that'll be the way to do it. So just submit one for that, and we can talk more about the logistics of that on Friday. Yeah, well, I'm working on the Celsius drink. I'm not really working. I haven't gotten one yet. Do you buy it at a, will they have it at Safeway? Can I get this drink at Safeway? All right, so let's go ahead. Let's zoom back in time here all the way to the archaic Greek culture. All right. So one of the big developments that we get here is an intellectual development, all right? So natural philosophy takes off. So we're not quite to Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. That's going to come in what we generally consider the classical period of Greece. But we get people thinking about things in a very new way. Now, what I want to highlight here is that, like, it's not like the world was a bunch of idiots prior to the Greeks showing up, okay? I mean, we can look all the way back to ancient Egypt, and we've got a 365-day calendar, right? I mean, I don't even know how if somebody did not tell me that, like, there were 365 days in a year, I'm not sure I would have figured it out myself. But that development goes back thousands and thousands of years. In Mesopotamia, right, they're tracking, like, planetary motion. I can't even tell a planet from a star when I look at the sky, and somehow they're able to track the movement of, like, Jupiter and Venus and different planets through the sky. So there's not, it's not coming out of nowhere, but nonetheless, it's a big deal. Now, the first movement comes from the region of Ionia, right? And again, when we look at that, this is kind of the west coast of modern-day Turkey. This is also where Homer likely would have been from if he was an actual person, or the groups of singers would have come from this region. This period of natural philosophy is known as the Ionian Enlightenment. And there are a handful of different philosophers, you don't need to remember their exact names here, but a handful of philosophers that start thinking of things in a kind of very, very different way. Now, prior to this, one of the frequent explanations was, oh, like, why does lightning strike? Oh, it's Zeus throwing a thunderbolt, right? Or like, why does the sun cross the sky? Oh, well, that's just like Helios or Apollo in his chariot taking the sun across the sky. And so what these guys start to do, the really, really big kind of development here, is they start to look for explanations of things, right? Asking why things occur and trying to come up with answers that don't involve the gods. Okay? Now, they didn't get it perfect. So like one of the guys here kind of sees the world operating all going back to, he basically explains that everything in the world is a form of water. Okay? And he saw this because, you know, water, it can turn into ice, right? Or ice can turn into water. And then water can also turn into steam. And so you can see it as like a liquid and a solid and a metal. And he's kind of saying that, you know, water is the core of everything, right? And he's not that far off in the sense that it is a major part of a lot of different things. But even though he's wrong in the ultimate explanation there, that idea, right, that everything can be explained without the gods, and that an explanation that makes sense in one area, right, also should apply to other areas where it's similar. That sort of thing, that's what we call like knowledge across systems. Those are major developments of the Ionian Enlightenment. Okay, so new versions of philosophy, that's one of the big things of the Archaic period in Greece. People start asking why things occur and trying to explain it without going back to the gods. Sculpture and art, major developments during this period as well. So what we get is we get the development of kind of human life-size sculpture in Greece. Now, when this develops, you can see a distinct link to the sculpture and the forms of ancient Egypt, all right? So if you look at this dude over here, this is a sculpture that goes back more than 4,000 years, right? More than almost 2,000 years before the Greeks even start making these kind of sculptures, all right? And it happens very shortly after the Greeks set up their first colony in Egypt. That's when you start getting these forms. So now Crates, the first colony in Egypt, set up in the middle of the 7th century. Shortly after that, you get these forms based on the Egyptian form. And when you start to line them all up, you can see the development over time, okay? So this is a very, very early one. It's still pretty rigid. It's still pretty stylized. You can see a couple decades later, it's still relatively stylized, but a little bit more lifelike with a focus on the body. By the time you start to get towards 500, things have smoothed out a little bit, right? The musculature has become a little bit more lifelike, still very idealized, but a little bit more lifelike, a little bit smoother. Some of the characteristics of this archaic style of sculpture, you get these kind of almond-shaped eyes. You always get like a little bit of a smile. This is what they call it, the archaic smile. But that's frequently there. And when you get into the classical period, you'll see that people aren't smiling as much anymore. It becomes much more severe. And these styles of sculpture, the male ones are known as a kouros, and the female one, right over here, a kouri. But again, based on Egyptian styles and derived from them shortly after, Greece sets up shop in Egypt. All right, Archaic period is also when we start to get the like temples that you guys know and love, all right? So remember, in the 8th century, we start to get the development of temples as a house for the gods. And we don't have the actual structures anymore, but we have like a little model of one from this temple of Hera at the site of Argos. Now we fast forward a little bit later, in the 7th century, in the 600s, we get the first what's known as the Hekatapada, right? And this is a Greek term for the 100-foot temples. And these are the huge temples that you start to think of. Originally, they would have been built in wood. And then later on, starting in the 500s, you get them built in stone. Again, we're still kind of clearly in the Archaic period, but we start to get temples that look exactly what you imagine, right, when you think of an ancient Greek temple. These are what we call peripteral temples, and what that means is that the colonnades go around on all four sides, right? So you get the columns surrounding the temple. That's what we call a peripteral temple. Now, if you've got your little sketchbook, right, what I want you guys to do, we're going to have a little art history lesson here in the three different types of Greek temples. These are the orders of Greek architecture here. And what we've got is we've got Doric and Ionic and Corinthian. All right? And we're going to start with the Dork Temple. Well, actually, we'll start by talking about kind of all three of them. There are lots of little things that differentiate these. But when you go to Italy or you go to Greece, right? And you're there with your friends or your girlfriend or your boyfriend and you want to really impress them, right? What you want to do is you want to be able to look at the column top, right? This is known as the capital, this little thing that sits on top of the column. So this little thing here, this little thing here, this little thing here, that's known as the capital. And that's the easiest way to distinguish between the different orders of architecture. So in the Doric order, what we've got is we've got this kind of bowl-shaped capital, right? Very plain and simple. If you're looking on top of it and it just kind of looks like a plain bowl, you're in the Doric order of architecture. All right? Now, when we zoom over here to the Ionic order, right, from Ionia, what we see when we look at these capitals is these have the scrolls, right? Think of it as like the capital is like a little scroll on top of the column here. And when you see that, what we call those things volutes, right? But those really scroll-looking things, you can be pretty certain you're dealing with an Ionic temple. And then when we zoom forward here to the Corinthian style, this is the most recent, the kind of newest style of architecture here. But when we zoom over, these are the ones with flowers sticking out everywhere. So when you've got, capitals with flowers all over the place, there you're dealing with a Corinthian order of architecture, a Corinthian capital. Now, there are other things that go along with these, right? When you deal with Doric temples, you get triglyphs and metopes, these things up here. An Ionic temple tends to have a frieze up at the top. Ionic ones sit on column bases, whereas Doric temples just sit flat on the kind of stylobate here, which is the platform that the temple sits on. You can write those things down if you want. The big thing that you should be able to focus on is, like, if you got a picture of a temple, what you want to do is zoom in on the capital, right? And you should be able to tell from that, right, whether you're dealing with Doric or Ionic or Corinthian there. And so draw a little picture for yourself of each of those capitals and the terms for each. And when you do get to go over and see these things, you can check them out. All right, and then our final thing today, let's make a little sketch of what we're looking at here, right? This is a rough prototype of what like a Greek temple plan looks like, right? So we're looking down on top of it. The Hera style is what surrounds it, right? So when you're looking at all the columns, you call that the peristyle, or the colonnade is derived from the Latin term for it. But that's the peristyle. And then you have the actual building itself. And the building frequently has 3 rooms, okay? So the pronaos, that's the little entryway or the kind of entry vestibule. Then you've got the sanctuary itself. In Greek, this is known as the naos. And that's where the cult statue of the god lives, right? The god, the embodiment of the god, the statue itself embodies the god. It lives inside the sanctuary, inside the naos. The cella is the Latin term for it. And then behind it, you get the opisthedomos, right? We'll cover that word again on Friday. But this is kind of the treasury. So when people bring gifts for the gods, right? A bronze tripod or a little sculpture or something like that, that would get stored in this little area behind the sanctuary, the opisthedomos. That's where things would get stored, these gifts for the gods. So let's go ahead. We will wrap it up there for today. And what we will do is we will pick up with the story of kind of Greek cultural developments during the Archaic on Friday. And then we'll also talk about finding sources, how to find those things so that you guys are ready to go for your research proposal. So have a wonderful couple days, guys, and I will see you back here on Friday. All right. Bye, everyone.